If the flood wiped out every giant on earth, why does Scripture describe them ruling entire kingdoms centuries later? Enoch's forgotten timeline reveals something the church never wanted you to ask. Genesis tells us the flood came to wash the earth clean. Every living thing outside the ark was to be erased. Every beast, every bloodline, every trace of the corruption that had spread across the land. That's the story most of us grew up with. Clean slate, fresh start, Noah and his family stepping onto dry ground and the old world gone forever. But Scripture doesn't actually say that, not fully. Turn to Genesis 6:4, and you'll find a sentence that scholars have argued over for centuries, a sentence that seems to break the entire narrative we were taught in Sunday school. It says, "The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward." Afterward. Not, "and then they were gone." Afterward. As if the writer already knew you'd ask that question and answered it before you could. That single word has haunted theologians, translators, and rabbis for 2,000 years, because if the giants existed after the flood, then the flood didn't do what we were told it did. Something, or someone, survived. And what came next wasn't silence, it was kingdoms. Numbers 13:33 drops us into the land of Canaan, centuries after Noah, generations removed from the world that was supposed to have drowned. The spies sent by Moses come back trembling. They don't talk about crops or cities first, they talk about size. They say they saw the Nephilim there, the sons of Anak, descendants of the Nephilim, and next to them the spies felt like grasshoppers. Grown men, warriors, chosen specifically for their courage, reduced to insects in their own eyes. That's not exaggeration for effect, that's trauma written into Scripture. And the sons of Anak weren't an isolated tribe hiding in some forgotten valley. Deuteronomy 2 and 3 give us something far bigger, a map, almost, of giant civilizations spread across the land east of the Jordan. The text names them one by one, like a genealogy of monsters the Israelites were forced to reckon with. The Emim, described as a people great and many, and tall as the Anakim. The Zamzummim, a people great and many and tall, feared even by other giants. And then Og, king of Bashan, the last of the remnant of the Rephaim, whose iron bed measured over 13 feet long. Deuteronomy records the measurement like a court document, like proof that had to be preserved, because no one would believe it otherwise. Think about what that means. Not one giant, not a single bloodline that slipped through some crack in the flood narrative. An entire network of giant peoples, with kings, with territory, with cities fortified high with walls. Deuteronomy actually describes 60 cities in Bashan alone, walled and gated. A kingdom built by beings Scripture insists shouldn't have existed anymore. These weren't scattered wanderers living off the land in isolation. They had infrastructure. They had governance. They had generational memory of who they were and where their strength came from, passed down long enough to build 60 fortified cities from nothing. That takes centuries. That takes stability. Somewhere in the fog between Noah stepping off the ark and Moses standing at the edge of the Jordan, an entire civilization of giants had time to rise, organize, and dig in behind walls thick enough that ordinary armies wouldn't dare approach them. So where does Enoch fit into this? The Book of Enoch, ancient, revered by early believers, quoted directly in the Book of Jude, gives us the origin story that Genesis only hints at. The Watchers, angelic beings who abandoned their assigned place, came down and took human wives. Their offspring were the Nephilim, giants whose violence and hunger consumed the earth long before the flood ever came. Enoch describes them devouring everything humanity produced, then turning on humanity itself, then turning on each other. It's a horror story disguised as ancient history. And it explains why the flood was sent in the first place, not simply human wickedness in the abstract, but a corrupted bloodline that had to be stopped before it consumed creation entirely. But here's where Enoch's account becomes something more than backstory. It becomes a warning about aftermath. Because if the corruption was spiritual as much as physical, if it was a rupture in the created order, not just a population that could be drowned, then water alone was never going to be enough to erase it completely. Jubilees, another ancient text treasured by early Jewish communities, describes evil spirits proceeding from the bodies of the dead giants, spirits that continued to lead humanity astray long after the flood receded. Not the giants' flesh surviving, something else, something the waters couldn't reach. That's the thread we're going to follow through this video. How the giant bloodlines reappear on the far side of the flood, how they organize into kingdoms with names and borders, and kings whose beds needed to be measured because no one would trust the report, and how the battle to remove them from the promised land wasn't a side note in Israel's history. It was, in many ways, the main event. Joshua doesn't just conquer territory. Joshua finishes something Noah's flood started and never completed. Before we go further into Bashan, into the Anakim strongholds, into the war that Moses and Joshua were commanded to fight against beings Scripture calls Rephaim, the dead, the shades, the ones who shouldn't have still been walking. I want to point you towards something that goes even deeper into this hidden timeline than we have room for in a single video. We put together an illustrated guide called The Forbidden Book of Enoch. What it reveals about the Watchers, giants, and the world before the flood. It walks through Enoch's full account, the fall of the Watchers, the birth and behavior of the Nephilim, and the spiritual aftermath Jubilees describes, the pieces most churches never teach because the original books were removed from the canon centuries ago. If you've ever felt like there were chapters of the biblical story missing, this fills in exactly those gaps, with illustrations that bring the Watchers and their offspring to life in a way that stays with you. The link is pinned in the first comment below this video. And if this kind of research, the kind that goes past the surface of Scripture, into what was actually recorded by the ancients, speaks to something in you, subscribe to the channel. We're building a place for people who want the fuller story, not the simplified one, and we're only getting started. Now let's step into Bashan and meet the king whose bed had to be measured because no one believed the report. Bashan sat in the north, across the Jordan, rich land, volcanic soil, the kind of ground that grows oak forests and fattens cattle without much effort. And ruling over it was Og, a name that shows up like a shadow every time Scripture wants to remind Israel what kind of enemy still walked the earth after the flood. Deuteronomy 3 doesn't soften him. Jude calls him the last of the remnant of the Rephaim, the last meaning there had been others, meaning an entire line of giant kings had ruled this territory before him, and by the time Israel arrived, Og was what remained. His bed is the detail people remember, and for good reason. Iron 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide, somewhere around 13.5 feet by 6 feet by most reckonings. Deuteronomy tells us it was kept in Rabbah on display, as if the writer knew future generations would need physical proof, something you could go measure yourself if you doubted the account. Ancient authors didn't usually pause a war narrative to give furniture dimensions. They did it here because the size of the man demanded it, because without the measurement, the story would sound like exaggeration, and with it, the story becomes testimony. Israel didn't walk around Bashan. They went straight through it, straight at it. Numbers 21 records the battle at Edrei, where Og came out with his full army to meet them, confident, a king who had likely never faced a force willing to stand against him. And God's instruction to Moses before the battle carries a weight worth sitting with: do not be afraid of him, because he has been given into your hand, along with all his people and his land, and you are to do to him as you did to Sihon, king of the Amorites. That's not a throwaway line, that's reassurance offered specifically because the fear was real, because facing the last king of the Rephaim was not something Israel's army could shrug off. 60 cities fell. An entire giant kingdom, generations in the building, ended in a single campaign. It's worth pausing on why God's own words needed to address fear directly. Israel had already conquered Sihon just before this, a real victory, a real army defeated. And still, when Og's name came up, the instruction had to be repeated, had to be specific. That tells you something about the reputation this bloodline carried through the ancient world. Sihon was a king. Og was something else in the minds of the people marching toward him. A living reminder of the giants their ancestors' ancestors had once feared enough to weep over at the edge of the promised land 40 years earlier. The trauma from Numbers 13 hadn't faded. It had been passed down generation to generation until it met its resolution here on the plains of Edrei, where a bloodline that had survived the flood itself was finally brought to an end by human hands acting under divine command. But Bashan wasn't the only giant stronghold standing between Israel and the land they were promised. Move south and west into Canaan proper, and you find the Anakim, the people whose sons had terrified the spies back in Numbers 13. Hebron was their capital, a city so old and so significant that Genesis mentions it by name generations earlier, when Abraham himself walked its hills and buried Sarah in a cave nearby. That same city, by the time of Joshua, belonged to the sons of Anak, Sacsayhuamán and Talmai, named individually in Joshua 15, as if the text wanted their identities preserved rather than folded into an anonymous enemy mass. Joshua 11 gives us the summary of the campaign against them, and the language is almost surgical. Joshua cut off the Anakim from the hill country, from Hebron, from Debir, from Anab, from all the hill country of Judah and Israel. He devoted them to destruction with their cities. None of the Anakim were left in the land of the people of Israel. None, except, the text adds, in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod, some survived. That detail matters more than it first appears, and we'll come back to it, because those three cities become important later in Israel's story, in ways most people never connect back to this moment. It's the kind of loose thread Scripture leaves on purpose, a small crack left open in an otherwise total victory, and cracks like that tend to matter far more than the parts of the story we already understand. The Rephaim show up again and again across this territory, not as a single tribe but almost as a category, a classification for giant-blooded peoples wherever Israel encountered them. The Valley of Rephaim sits near Jerusalem itself, named for what once lived there. Genesis 14 mentions a coalition of kings striking down the Rephaim in Ashtaroth Karnaim, the Zuzim in Ham, and the Emim in the plain of Kiriathaim. Three separate giant peoples, three separate locations, all documented in a single military campaign centuries before Moses was even born. This wasn't folklore stitched together after the fact. This was geography, recorded as it happened. Giant nations spread across the land like any other kingdom of the ancient world, with names, with territory, with wars fought against them by other kings who took their existence as plainly as they took the existence of Egypt or Babylon. What strikes you once you start tracing these references across Genesis, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and Joshua is how matter-of-fact Scripture treats all of it. There's no moment where the text stops to explain how giants exist after a flood that supposedly ended all flesh outside the ark. The writers simply record what was there, the way a historian records the nations bordering their own. It's almost as if the strangeness of it was invisible to them, as if this was common knowledge in the ancient world, not a theological puzzle requiring justification, but a fact of life on the frontier of the Promised Land. And that raises the real question this timeline forces us to confront. If the flood was meant to end the corruption Enoch describes, the Watchers, their offspring, the violence that filled the earth, why did Moses need direct reassurance not to fear a giant king centuries later? Why did an entire generation of Israelite spies come back paralyzed with terror at the sight of men descended from the very beings the flood was supposed to erase? Something survived that judgment, something rebuilt, and Scripture, without ever slowing down to explain itself, hands us the pieces to figure out exactly how. That crack left open in Joshua's account, Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod, the three cities where Anakim survived, doesn't stay quiet for long. Generations later, in the valley of Elah, a champion steps out from the ranks of the Philistines, and 1 Samuel 17 tells us exactly where he's from: Goliath of Gath. Not a random giant appearing out of nowhere in Israel's history, a direct descendant of the bloodline Joshua couldn't fully remove, standing in a city Scripture had already flagged generations earlier as a place where the Anakim held on. His measurements read almost like Og's bed did, 6 cubits and a span, somewhere around 9.5 feet depending on which ancient manuscript tradition you follow, though even the more conservative readings still put him well over 7 feet, armored in bronze scale mail weighing 5,000 shekels, carrying a spear with an iron head weighing 600 shekels. The text lingers on the hardware the way it lingered on Og's bed, proof offered in physical, measurable terms, because the writer understood the claim needed backing. No other warrior in the entire narrative of 1 and 2 Samuel gets this kind of itemized description, not Saul described as standing head and shoulders above the people, and not any of David's mighty men, however legendary their exploits become. Only Goliath receives an inventory. Weighed and measured like Og's bed was recorded in Rabbah, as if Scripture anticipated the same disbelief and armed itself against it in advance. And when David finally faces him, he doesn't frame it as one warrior against another. He says the whole earth will know that Israel has a God, because the battle is not won by sword and spear. That framing matters. David wasn't just fighting a large man. He understood the way earlier generations understood facing Og, that this was a confrontation with something the flood was meant to have ended for good. Goliath wasn't alone in his household either. 2 Samuel 21 lists his relatives almost like a roll call. Ishbi-Benob, who nearly killed David himself before one of his men intervened, described plainly as one of the descendants of the giants. Saph, another brother of Goliath killed by Elhanan, and a nameless man of great stature at Gath, 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 in all, also falling to David's men. 4 encounters, 1 family line, 1 city, Gath, that Scripture had marked back in Joshua as a refuge for what should have already been finished. Notice too how late in David's reign the Ishbi-Benob encounter happens. This is an aging king, worn down by decades of warfare, nearly killed by a single member of this bloodline, in a moment Scripture doesn't dress up or soften. David's own men have to step in and finish the fight for him. That's not the picture of an old threat fading into legend. That's a threat still capable of nearly ending a king in his own lifetime. The text closes that section with a single quiet sentence. These were descended from the giants in Gath, who fell by the hand of David and his servants. It reads almost like an epitaph for the entire bloodline, the final entry in a genealogy that started before the flood and ended, city by city, king by king, warrior by warrior, in the hands of Israel's kings. This is where the extra-biblical texts start filling gaps that Genesis, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and Samuel leave open. The Book of Giants, found among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran, gives voice to the Nephilim themselves in a way canonical Scripture never does. It shows them dreaming, terrified, aware that judgment is coming for them before the flood even arrives. 2 of the giants named in these fragments, Ohia and Hahia, dream of a tablet being washed and destroyed, of trees being uprooted. Imagery scholars connect directly to the coming flood, understood by the giants as their own inevitable end. What makes this text remarkable isn't just its age, it's the psychological interior it grants beings that Genesis mentions almost in passing. Fear, awareness, the sense of a countdown they couldn't stop. Reading it alongside Genesis 6 changes the way that short, sparse passage lands, because suddenly the giants aren't background figures in someone else's judgment story. They're characters who knew what was coming and couldn't outrun it, which makes their reappearance generations later in Bashan and Hebron and Gath land with even more weight. The Genesis Apocryphon, another Dead Sea Scroll, expands the moment right before the flood in a different direction. Lamech, Noah's father, doubting whether his son is truly his own child, troubled by the boy's strange appearance and asking Enoch himself to confirm the child's origin. It's a strange human moment folded into cosmic history, a father's suspicion set against a backdrop of angelic corruption spreading through every household on earth. These texts weren't written to entertain. Communities at Qumran preserved them, copied them by hand, treated them as meaningful enough to bury alongside their most sacred scrolls when Roman legions came for Jerusalem. Josephus, writing centuries later as a historian rather than a prophet, still felt the need to address these giants directly in his Antiquities of the Jews. He describes beings of prodigious size and different than men, credited by many nations with the ancient myths of giants fighting the gods, and he treats their existence as historical record, not legend to be waved away. A Jewish historian writing for a Roman audience, choosing to include this rather than quietly drop it, tells you the tradition was strong enough that omitting it would have looked like an evasion. He wasn't writing for believers who already accepted Enoch's account. He was writing for skeptical Roman readers who expected sober history, and he still judged the giant tradition worth defending on those terms. What all of this builds toward is a picture Scripture never draws directly, but leaves for us to assemble, piece by piece, city by city, genealogy by genealogy. The flood ended one chapter of a corruption that began with the Watchers. It didn't end the story, Bloodlines persisted, whether through survival, through some form of it happening again after the waters receded, or through spiritual corruption that Jubilees describes taking root in new forms. Kingdoms rose from that persistence. Bashan, the Anakim strongholds, Gath and its champions, and Israel's most defining battles, the ones we memorize as children, Goliath falling to a shepherd boy's sling, were never simple stories of courage. They were the continuation of a war that started before the flood and never fully ended, fought city by city, generation by generation, until Scripture finally records the last of them falling silent. If these bloodlines built kingdoms with names and kings, and 60 fortified cities in Bashan alone, the next question almost asks itself, what did they build before the flood? And more unsettling still, is any of it still standing? Baalbek in modern Lebanon holds a piece of engineering that still confuses people who study it for a living. Beneath the Roman temple complex built there in antiquity sits a foundation platform incorporating stones so massive that modern cranes would struggle to move them. 3 of these blocks, known together as the trilithon, each weigh somewhere around 800 tons. A quarry stone nearby, never fully moved from where it was cut, weighs even more, over 1,000 tons by most estimates. Rome didn't cut these. The evidence is clear that this foundation predates the Roman temple built on top of it, and no one has ever offered a fully satisfying explanation for how stones this size were quarried, transported, and set in place with the precision found at the site. Local tradition, recorded by ancient writers long before modern archaeology took interest, associated Baalbek with giants, with a period before recorded history when builders of extraordinary size and strength worked the land. Whether or not that's literal, the tradition didn't come from nowhere. Arab historians writing centuries later still repeated versions of the same story, attributing the foundation to a race of builders who lived before the flood of Noah, working under the direction of a ruler whose name shifts between accounts, but whose association with giants remains constant across nearly every telling. Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey pushes the timeline back even further, and in some ways it's more disturbing precisely because of how old it is. Carved stone pillars arranged in circles, some standing over 16 feet tall and weighing many tons, decorated with detailed reliefs of animals: scorpions, vultures, boars, serpents. Radiocarbon dating places construction at roughly 9600 BC, which puts it before agriculture, before pottery, before the wheel, before nearly every marker archaeologists use to define the beginning of civilization. Conventional history says organized society, with the labor coordination needed to move and carve stones like these, didn't exist yet. Göbekli Tepe says otherwise. Something was there, organized enough, skilled enough, motivated enough to build a monumental religious site thousands of years before the first cities we're taught about in school. And crucially, the site appears to have been deliberately buried, filled in intentionally by the people who built it, as if it were meant to be hidden rather than abandoned. Researchers still debate why anyone would go through the enormous labor of burying a site they'd worked so hard to raise, and the most common theories all point toward the same instinct: concealment, protection, a desire to keep something from being found or from being used again by whoever came next. Across the ocean, Puma Punku in Bolivia presents a different kind of mystery, not sheer size but precision. Andesite and diorite blocks, some of the hardest stone on Earth, cut with interlocking geometric joints so exact that they resemble machined parts rather than hand tools. The H-blocks found there fit together with a consistency that has led some researchers to question whether Bronze Age or Stone Age tools could have produced them at all. Nearby, Tiwanaku shows similar sophistication, monumental gateways and platforms, constructed at extreme altitude, over 12,000 feet above sea level, using techniques that still aren't fully understood. Sacsayhuamán, overlooking Cusco in Peru, offers yet another version of the same riddle. Limestone blocks weighing well over 100 tons each, fitted together without mortar so precisely that even now, a knife blade cannot slide between them. The walls have survived earthquakes that leveled Spanish colonial buildings, built centuries later, using conventional stone-cutting methods. Local Incan tradition credited these walls to a race that came before them, builders whose methods had already been lost by the time the Inca themselves rose to power. That's worth sitting with. Even the Inca, master builders in their own right, looked at Sacsayhuamán and attributed it to someone else, someone earlier, someone whose techniques they didn't fully possess. Spanish chroniclers recorded these Incan accounts directly, noting the confusion and reverence with which the Inca themselves discussed the origin of these walls. Not pride in their own ancestors' work, but something closer to awe at an inheritance they didn't fully understand. And then there's Yonaguni, off the coast of Japan, submerged beneath the ocean. Stepped terraces and sharp angular edges resting more than 80 feet underwater, debated fiercely between those who see natural rock formation and those who see deliberate construction. If it is what some researchers believe, it would place organized building activity at a time when sea levels were dramatically lower, pushing the timeline back toward the very window scripture places before the flood. None of these sites come with a plaque explaining who built them. That's precisely the point. Every one of them defies the timeline conventional archaeology wants to assign to human civilization, and every one of them sits in a category ancient historians and local traditions consistently associated with beings larger, older, and more capable than the humans who came after them. Enoch describes the Watchers teaching forbidden knowledge to humanity before the flood: metallurgy, the working of stone and metal, astronomy, techniques that Enoch explicitly says corrupted the earth by giving humanity power it wasn't meant to hold yet. If that knowledge existed, transmitted through a bloodline strong enough to move stones no modern crane can lift, monuments like these stop looking like unsolvable mysteries and start looking like fingerprints. Job 26:5, tucked into one of the oldest books of Scripture, mentions the Rephaim tremble beneath the waters, along with those who dwell in them, a strange, brief line that translators have wrestled with for centuries, but one that places these giant associated beings in connection with the deep, with water, with places beneath the surface of the world we walk on. Whether that's poetic language or something closer to memory passed down through generations, Scripture keeps circling back to the same idea from different angles, that something ancient, something powerful, something the flood was meant to end, left marks on this earth that neither water nor time has fully erased. It's a small detail, easy to skim past in a book known mostly for suffering and divine speeches out of the whirlwind, and yet it sits there quietly, connecting the giant bloodlines back to the sea one more time, back to the very element that was supposed to have ended their story completely. Jesus himself points back to this exact period when he wants his disciples to understand what the end of the age will look like. Matthew 24:37 records him saying, "As the days of Noah were, so will be the coming of the Son of Man." Most people hear that verse and think about wickedness in general terms, people eating, drinking, marrying, going about ordinary life, unaware of judgment approaching. That reading isn't wrong, but it's incomplete. Jesus chose a specific period in history to describe the end times, and that period, according to Genesis, Enoch, and Jubilees together, wasn't defined only by moral corruption in the abstract. It was defined by the Watchers, by the Nephilim, by a bloodline corrupting the created order itself. If Jesus is telling his followers that conditions before his return will mirror the days of Noah specifically, that's not a vague warning about bad behavior. That's a warning shaped by everything we've traced through this video. A warning that whatever happened before the flood might happen again in some form before the end. Paul gives us language that fits this same picture from a different angle. Ephesians 6:12 tells believers that the struggle isn't against flesh and blood, but against rulers, against authorities, against cosmic powers over this present darkness, against spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. Paul isn't inventing a new category of enemy here. He's describing something the Watcher's narrative already established centuries earlier, that behind human history, behind wars and kingdoms and bloodlines, there's a spiritual dimension of rebellion that started when angelic beings abandoned their assigned place. Exactly the language Jude uses when he references angels who did not stay within their own position of authority, but left their proper dwelling. Jude's letter, short as it is, might be the most direct bridge in the entire New Testament. Between the canonical text we read today and the book of Enoch, this whole timeline flows from. Jude quotes Enoch by name, directly, prophesying about the coming of the Lord, with 10,000s of his holy ones to execute judgment. That's not a passing illusion. That's a New Testament author treating Enoch's prophecy as authoritative enough to quote outright. In scripture that made it into the canon we still read from today, it's worth sitting with how unusual that is. Nowhere else in the New Testament does a writer directly name and quote a book that later church councils would leave out of the official canon. Jude clearly assumed his readers already knew Enoch's writings and respected them enough that citing them would strengthen his argument, not weaken it. Peter, written in a similar spirit, references God not sparing the angels when they sinned, but casting them into gloomy chains of deepest darkness to be kept until the judgment, language that lines up almost exactly with Enoch's own account of the watchers being bound beneath the earth to await final judgment. Daniel offers something different again, not a description of the watchers themselves, but a picture of cosmic conflict happening behind the visible events of human history. Daniel 10 describes an angelic messenger delayed 3 weeks by the prince of the kingdom of Persia, a spiritual entity resisting him, until Michael, one of the chief princes, comes to help. That's a direct scriptural statement that territorial spiritual powers stand behind earthly kingdoms, contesting, resisting, shaping outcomes in ways human beings on the ground never see. Daniel himself, fasting and praying for 3 full weeks without any sign his prayer had been heard, had no idea this invisible conflict was even taking place until the messenger finally arrived and explained the delay. That's a rare glimpse behind the curtain of a single answered prayer, and it changes how you read every other kingdom conflict scripture records. If that framework holds for Daniel's time, it's not a stretch to see the giant kingdoms of Bashan and Gath as territories with the same kind of spiritual backing behind their physical strength. Kingdoms that weren't only strong because their kings were tall, but because something stood behind them the way something stood behind Persia. The Sibylline Oracles, a collection of prophetic writings from the ancient world that blend Jewish and later Christian material, return again and again to the theme of giants and their downfall, describing a race of violent men, overbearing, whom the deluge overtook, foretelling their destruction in language that echoes Enoch almost verbatim in places. Targum's Pseudo-Jonathan, an Aramaic paraphrase and expansion of the Torah used in ancient synagogue teaching, goes even further, expanding on Genesis 6 to explicitly name the leaders among the watchers who descended, and describing how their offspring continued to trouble the earth. These weren't fringe texts scribbled by outsiders. They were part of how entire faith communities across centuries understood their own scripture, filling in details the compressed language of Genesis leaves to the imagination. What all of this builds toward is a picture of history that doesn't move in a straight line from corruption to flood, to clean resolution. It moves in cycles: corruption, judgment, partial victory, and then, centuries later, warnings that the same pattern will surface again before the final judgment described in Revelation. Revelation 9 describes locusts released from the abyss, beings with the power to torment for 5 months, commanded by an angel called Abaddon in Hebrew, Apollyon in Greek, the destroyer. Whatever exactly John saw in that vision, the imagery of beings released from beneath the earth, from a place of ancient imprisonment, to torment humanity before final judgment, sits remarkably close to Enoch's description of the watchers bound beneath the ground, awaiting their own release and reckoning. This is why the timeline matters so much more than a simple historical curiosity. If the giant kingdoms after the flood weren't a strange biblical footnote, but the direct continuation of a corruption Genesis, Enoch, Jubilees, and the Dead Sea Scrolls all describe as ongoing and unfinished, then Jesus' own words about the days of Noah carry a weight most modern readers never fully sit with. The pattern that produced Bashan, that produced Gath, that produced Goliath standing in the valley of Elah, Scripture suggests that pattern hasn't been permanently closed. It's been restrained. And restrained things, in every account we've walked through tonight, from Enoch's dreaming giants to Daniel's contested kingdoms, to John's locusts rising from the abyss, have a way of surfacing again when the appointed time finally comes. That's the thread running underneath every text we've traced tonight, and it's why this timeline deserves more attention than a single passing verse in Genesis usually gets. Bashan fell, Gath fell, Goliath fell. But the pattern behind them, Scripture suggests, never fully did. And that's a story worth carrying with you long after this video ends. If tonight opened your eyes to pieces of the Bible you were never taught in church, our illustrated guide, The Forbidden Book of Enoch, goes even deeper into the Watchers, the Nephilim, and the world before the flood. The link is pinned in the first comment. Thank you for spending this time with us tonight. If this timeline moved something in you, subscribe to the channel, like this video, and tell us in the comments which part surprised you most. More hidden history is waiting on your screen right now. Don't stop here.